Hello, everyone. I'm David Sanger. I'm White House and National Security Correspondent for the New York Times, and welcome to this special GZERO presentation. We are all live from the Munich Security Conference, probably the most important European security conference of the year, and of course, it comes at one of the most important turning points in European security in decades. It's been 2 years since this security conference actually took place in person, and we are all here pretty well debating how the next few days will work out before we even get to the question of how the next few months, years, and decades will work out. And so over the course of the next hour, we're going to be talking to people from the policy world, from the business world, from the think tank world, and all circulating around many of the same questions, which is, are we headed back to a different era, something more resembling the Cold War, something quite different from the Cold War? I'm delighted to start off with our co-hosts for all of this, Ian Bremmer, who's, of course, the president of the Eurasia group. Ian, thanks very much for having me here. And Brad Smith, the president and vice chair of Microsoft. So welcome to you both. Ian, let me start with you. We've all been talking about how things may sort out in Ukraine between now and maybe the end of the weekend. One theory is that Putin does what the Americans have been warning and does a major invasion. One theory is that he cuts the country off in bites. One theory is that he tries to do a Cobra strategy in which he stays around the border. And one strategy is that he picks up and withdraws just a bit, but keeps enough of a force there to make sure he stays at the center of attention. Where do you come down on that?
We all hope, of course, that the last is true, that negotiations work out. But certainly there's been no indication over the past 72 hours, any of the pieces of news that have come out of Russia, that have come out of the occupied piece of Ukraine, all point towards escalation. And I think that's what we're hearing from the Americans and from the NATO allies in Europe. The fact is that this is a uniquely coherent and cohesive Munich Security Conference because every NATO ally is completely convinced of the importance of the mission of the Munich Security Conference, the importance of the shared values, which is absolutely not true 2 years ago when we met and everyone was talking about Westlessness, a rudderlessness, a world that didn't know what the West was all about. Did we belong post-Brexit, America first in the United States? No one's talking about any of that. You haven't heard any Brexit this time around. Donald Trump hasn't been mentioned this time around, right? But I do think that Putin is not going to make it easy for NATO to continue to stay aligned. He wants to give the West more opportunities to screw up. And so if he is intent on escalating, I don't think it's a sudden blitzkrieg to Kiev and the ouster of the Zelensky government. I think it's much more likely to look like a recognition of the independence of the breakaway territory of Donbass. And then they would request Russian troops to come in. Their leaders have just in the last 2 hours declared evacuation of Russians from their territories to Russia after yesterday at the United Nations, the Russian government said that they were being exterminated by the Ukrainian government, which is false. So I think those are the steps you see with the hope, if you're Putin, that leads to more skittishness of some NATO allies, less alignment of NATO, more opportunities for the Russians to get more of what they want without potentially having to go full scale into Ukraine.
Just to drill down on that once briefly, and then I want to ask Brad a little bit about the cyber element of all of this. But the theory of the case, if your argument is right, is that he would take a piece of the country, bite it off, see if NATO and the rest of Europe stayed aligned on sanctions for taking what is essentially the Russian-speaking part of the country, and then keep moving forward inch by inch.
I mean, he already occupies that territory. So far, there is some level of implausible lack of accountability, implausible deniability that Putin clearly wants to have. You remember, it's like with the opposition leader Navalny. He tries to kill him, but he doesn't admit to it. He has a faked up Trump trial when he shows up in Moscow before he jails him. Why? Because he wants to show that he's completely justified and legitimate in the action he's taken. That's been his consistent modus operandi vis-a-vis the West in every single thing he has done internationally on the stage. Why would that change with the biggest decision that he will have made of his presidency?
That's right. So, Brad, there's a common element to every one of these scenarios we have seen. And the common element is that cyber plays a central role in the way that it really never has before. And that would be if he doesn't invade and he just uses attacks to try to destabilize a country. It would be if he does. So what are we learning? You dealt with this brilliantly in Tools and Weapons, great book on the state and private use of cyber for good and ill. What are we learning here about what the limits of cyber capabilities for Putin is?
Well, I think, first of all, I would join Ian in saying we hope that the next few days will bring a triumph for diplomacy. I think that would benefit everyone and would benefit the world. When I think about what a company like ours does, what the tech sector needs to do and does do every day, it is fundamentally protect our customers around the world, whether they be individuals, NGOs, companies, or in this case, governments. And we need to protect them. We seek to protect them from attacks from others. I think the first thing that is sort of self-evident when we step back and consider it is even if aspects of the 20th century come back into bold relief, there's a lot of 21st century overlay over 20th century reality, and a lot of it has to do with technology and cyber. Every government around the world runs almost first and foremost on digital infrastructure. A lot of that digital infrastructure, virtually all of it, if you will, is either created, designed, distributed by technology companies. Much of it is operated by technology companies. When you look not only at the cloud, but the cybersecurity protection that we provide. And so, what we've seen over the last month is some obvious reports. We've been among them in terms of reporting. Where there have been, initial stages of attacks on the critical infrastructure and the digital infrastructure of the Ukrainian government. We're also seeing a rise in disinformation relating to Ukraine. And that's when we need to step forward and have sought to do so, to protect to the extent we can, in part by informing a government when we see them under attack.
Well, thanks, Brad. We're going to come back to that. It's going to be a theme throughout our hour here. I want to bring into this Mircea Geoană, NATO's Deputy Secretary General. He's the first person to serve in this role from Romania and the first from a nation that joined NATO after the Cold War was over. Welcome, Mr. Geoană. Great to have you here. Let me start you with the same question that we were discussing with Brad Smith, which is we expect that this set of actions, whether it is a kinetic one or a non-kinetic one, is going to have a huge cyber aspect to it, especially perhaps if it is non-kinetic, because it would be the main way that Putin might seek to destabilize Ukraine. So tell us how NATO is prepared for that and what you still need to get done.
First, I would like to echo what the other colleagues and friends have been saying. We encourage the diplomatic way forward. As we are working for the best, we are preparing for the worst. So in our analysis, in all scenarios that the Russian leadership would use against Ukraine, cyber is across the board. It's part of a, let's say, non-kinetic operation. It's part of a destabilization operation. It's part of a huge disinformation campaign, trying to take out command and control centers of the Ukrainian military. So from the most severe scenario to the relatively milder scenario, cyber is a transversal part. And this is part of modern warfare. And this is why NATO has adopted cyber as an operational domain in everything we do since 2016. So anticipate cyber to play a massive role in and around Ukraine.
So
and also Russia is also using and abusing cyber also against NATO allies as we speak. It's not only about Ukraine; it's about all of us.
Sure. So one of the things I've noticed in dealing with NATO is your first cyber activities were largely defensive. You built a really impressive center north of Brussels to defend your own networks and so forth. But one of the things that we've seen in the United States and Britain, elsewhere, is a very major buildup of offensive capability. What does NATO have along those lines now? Can you begin to act or draw on the resources of GCHQ, the National Security Agency, U.S. Cyber Command, the way you could draw on nuclear forces if you needed to?
NATO is a defensive alliance. And when we decided that cyber is an operational domain, we also took the decision, all allied nations, that a massive cyber attack could trigger Article 5. So, speaking of that, I run the cyber adaptation effort on behalf of Secretary General inside NATO. So, what we are doing right now, we have a very robust cyber defense policy in NATO, which is improving every day and getting stronger every day, with the help of the private sector. That's, if you want, the indispensable partnership that we have with the private sector. But also individually, allied nations, I can name a few, many of those, are lending to NATO their offensive capabilities still under national control in case of operations and missions that NATO might take.
So please do name a few of them.
I think US, UK, Canada, Denmark, Estonia, a number of those. So that's a very interesting, and that's the uniqueness and beauty of NATO, if you want, because on the one side, we keep our defensive role as an alliance, but also when the case might arise, nations can basically use NATO and the command and control of NATO to use these issues. So for the time being, we have this kind of special arrangement. Individual allies are lending to NATO in case there are offensive capabilities in cyber as well.
So, Ian, let me come back to you just to respond to Mr. Geoană's statements here. So, we've all been in years of trying to deter Vladimir Putin in cyberspace and, of course, in traditional military activities. I have to say I'm unimpressed with the results so far, right?
I think that's fair. Yeah.
He messed around in Ukraine in 2014, moved on to the United States in 2016, did NotPetya, which was the largest, Brad written a lot about that, largest and most expensive cyber attack in modern times, is inside everybody's power grid. We're inside of his, and now has moved on to, back to Ukraine. What does that tell you we're missing here?
Well, I mean, two things. First of all, the willingness of President Putin to take risks that have the potential to escalate, maybe unintentionally, is much more significant than that of other major powers in the world today, including China. I think specifically about NotPetya, which was obviously intended as cyber attacks directed at Ukraine.
Right.
Had 1% of GDP, it kind of took off, right? But it also caused billions of damage to Western firms operating around the world, like Maersk, for example, almost bankrupted one of the world's most important shipping companies.
Federal Express,
for example, Mondelez was it. That wasn't Mondelez. It wasn't intended, but they did it, right? And so, I mean, clearly, when I see, for example, the attacks that were the strikes that were just made yesterday against a Ukrainian kindergarten in the strip neutral zone between the contact zones. Near the occupied territory. I mean, what if kids had been killed? What's the escalatory ramp as a consequence? Very, very dangerous. So the first is that we have to recognize that Putin has shown a willingness to roll the dice in ways that matter. The second that I would say briefly is that you remember when Biden met with Putin in Geneva in June. That was Biden's agenda. It wasn't Putin's. Right now it's Putin's agenda. Biden wasn't talking about Ukraine. He was talking about attacks on critical infrastructure, cyber. And he said, if you don't stop those attacks, right after Colonial Pipeline attack, that we are going to respond seriously. And frankly, within months, the United States government, intelligence agencies, and the rest saw a notable decline in Russian attacks against cyber. So, I mean, the ability of the Russians and the willingness of Putin to respond when Biden says, this matters, it's a priority to me, it's less of a priority to you, do something about it, has success. In between those two things, we now have the Ukraine situation.
Mr. John, I know your time is limited, so I'm just going to ask you one last question along these lines, which is, if we, in the next 2 days, weeks, or months, see just cyber activity, but not troops going over the border, do you think that there will be a unified European and NATO response?
Let me tell you, first of all, that I'm an old hand in politics and international affairs. In my capacity at NATO and in my national capacities in Romania, I served in Washington, so I've never seen a more intense, diversified, and intense consultation from our US allies with the rest of the alliance like we see today. The first thing that, speaking of Geneva, the first thing that Wendy Sherman did after meeting the Russian counterpart in the Strategic Stability Dialogue, first thing, come to NATO, brief allies. President Biden, today, Vice President Harris, Tony Blinken, Lloyd Austin, Ann Neuberger from the MSC, Jake Sullivan. And the fact that there was so much investment in making sure that all of us understand the depth of the strategic danger that Russia poses has helped, I would say, an unprecedented level of unity inside the alliance. I have to be honest, sometimes 30 nations in an alliance, 30 democracies, not everything is perfect every single time. But now I would really say that it's an impeccable unity. The fact that the US is also talking to our European Union partners, because sanctions are part of the arsenal that also EU has also been impeccable. I cannot prejudge what we will do, if there will be one scenario or the other, but I want to say one thing very seriously. Also, attempts to destabilize a democratic regime in Kiev is something that we'll consider as an aggression. Things that are basically trying to foment change of democratic regimes is also something very severe. Let's see what happens in the next few days and few weeks. We are preparing for the worst while giving diplomacy a chance. That's what we do. That's what Secretary General Stoltenberg is doing. All allies are doing. Also individually, we applaud the diplomatic effort done by allies. We hope that, let's say, reason and prudence would prevail. If not, for NATO allies and NATO territory, we are rock solid. And that's probably one of the good sides of this very unfortunate turn of events.
Great. Well, thank you, Mr. Geoană, for spending the time with us. We really appreciate it. We hope we'll have some time to talk to you again in the near future, and for helping share your views with us. Brad, I wanted to come back to you on something you were saying before about the role of companies in playing the sense. So I'll let up a trade secret here. When I've got a big intelligence question that comes up, particularly in the cyber realm, networks and so forth, I guess I could call the NSA and wait for a week for them to call me back, or I could go to your very talented group at the Digital Crimes unit you set up. Google's got a very impressive one, Digital Threats, and so forth. So we're in one of these odd worlds right now where the best intelligence we get in this arena we've been talking about actually comes from you guys. In fact, it was SolarWinds was first revealed by your company working, of course, with one of the major private security firms, Mandiant. How does that affect the dynamics here?
Well, I would never say that we necessarily have the best source of intelligence, but we do have a very important set of data, and we work every day to make sure that we're identifying new threats and attacks, regardless of where they're from, regardless of which customer they're against. And we basically operate with a principle that part of the value proposition we offer to our customers is, frankly, a duty to protect them. And that duty typically begins by letting them know when we see they're under attack. And if you just look at the nature of the data set that we have, literally the trillions of signals that come back into our data centers around the world, either from Windows devices, cloud services that are running in our data center, or endpoints, might be iPhones and Android phones that are being protected by our security services, we see a lot.
And how much of that, Brad, is shared in real time with governments, the US government, the British government, NATO?
Our first premise and principle is really to share it with the customer that's being attacked.
Sure.
So,
But if the attack is coming from a nation state, it's good that the customer knows that so they can lock down the hatches, but there's not a whole lot they can go do in response.
It depends on the customer. It depends on whether they're running in the cloud. It depends on whether they've done a good job of basically deploying good cybersecurity hygiene. So, we have a team that, is all about responding to these incidents and going immediately, sometimes sending people to a specific country or government. And then there are times in an appropriate way, typically with the customer's consent, that we would let others know as well. And then there's more generalized threat intelligence that we may inform others of, not just governments, but the public.
Right.
One of the reasons that we publish material about what we're seeing is because when we see a new technique or tactic or practice being used, we recognize that it's a threat that can spread, as Ian was describing before with NotPetya. So we typically publish something, and then the whole world knows about it. The security community can rally around addressing it, and all of our customers worldwide can take steps to protect against it.
Terrific. Well, I'm glad now that we are also joined by Benedikt Franke. He's the CEO of the Munich Security Conference. This is the last of the MSC, the Munich Security Conferences, that are being overseen directly by our friend Wolfgang Ischinger. And Mr. Franke, I am delighted to have you with us here. This would be a tough transition if it was a quiet time. But tell us, what's it like to be running this security conference with the looming thought that before it's over, we could see the resumption of war in Europe?
Thanks for having me, David. Yeah, organizing the Munich Security Conference is difficult in the best of times. It's been really challenging this time round. It's been challenging because of COVID.
Sure.
It's been challenging because of maximum uncertainty regarding rules and regulations. They keep changing all the time in all the countries that we deal with, and here in Bavaria too. And it's been challenging because the backdrop is so dramatic. There are some people that say, oh, this must be so great for you. From a PR perspective, it may be, but obviously from a diplomatic perspective, from a content perspective, it's a disaster. For the first time since 1999, we don't have a Russian delegation here. The Chinese participants are only joining virtually. And what we've built up over the last decade or so, namely a global platform to discuss topics that are difficult, but at eye level, that has been made very difficult by the combination of COVID and the situation in Eastern Europe. So obviously, yes, it has made the conference even more interesting to the world, but it has also made it more challenging to organize.
I was here 2 years ago, and I remember it distinctly because it was the last conference I went to and the last overseas trip I did before the world went into lockdown. And now when we come back, it seems to me that you've got, as Wolfgang himself noted earlier today, a number of different threads running. Obviously, the threat to Ukraine, to sovereignty, and to democracy. You've got a threat that comes out of pandemic, something that we all had in the back of our minds, but we weren't spending much time talking about 2 years ago. We have climate change, something we were talking about 2 years ago, but on which I would say progress has been sort of minimal in the past 2 years. So when you put these together, how do you put together the hierarchy of threats to stability out of those?
When we came up with the term of westlessness 2 years ago, people liked the term, and they said it got a discussion starting, and they were really keen for us to come up with something more positive this time round. So we thought long and hard, and the crises are piling up, and it's not just the experts that can count them down. It's the broader public now. In the broader public, we are seeing a feeling of helplessness. And so we figured, while we would have loved to be more positive than last time round, we should really call a spade and talk about this feeling of helplessness, this feeling of helplessness in the face of so many different crises that seem, each and every one of them, too complex to handle, and the combination of them just overwhelming. And so when we tried to rank them, we thought long and hard whether we rank them, thematically, we rank them by region, we rank them by intensity, and it's virtually impossible. And that really shows how difficult it must be for the broader public to understand what's going on, because this sort of situation of constant alarm, going from the migration crisis to the next crisis, the climate crisis, the hunger crisis, the polypandemic, as we call it, we are seeing the risk awareness of populations in the countries that deal with us, or that we deal with, rising constantly, and hence trying to tell them what risk is more important than the other has been a futile exercise for us, at least. So what we've now done is we treat them all the same. And this is why when you look through our program, we have a global day, we have a regional day, we have a European day, but we don't rank them. And I think that's the only thing that we can do.
Let me just ask you one more, because I know your time with us is limited as you're trying to keep the three-ring circus of the security conference going. But might you see a little bit of a glimmer of hope versus the helplessness part in the fact that we now have vaccines, even if we are underperforming in getting them out to people in less wealthy parts of the world, and that the Russian threat of invasion has brought Europe and NATO together in a way I don't remember seeing in my professional career?
Yes, so I think there are many lower hanging fruits out there that we can and must grab. I mean, the second point of our helplessness argument is it's man-made, and we can overcome it. Many of these problems, most of these problems are man-made, and solutions must be man-made too. And I think we just need to find the willingness again to try together, and nothing binds together as a good crisis, and we must not let these crises go to waste. And so we believe and we hope that from this conference and from the conference that are now possible again in the next couple of months, a signal goes that we can talk to each other and we can come up with specific solutions. And that's why we are so keen to promote specific solutions at this conference and not end up as a talking shop.
Well, thank you, Mr. Franke. I know I speak for everybody here to say, first of all, thanks for having us here. It's actually great to be here in person and have a chance again to see everybody. And we'll hope that you invite us back, but not only that you invite us back, but that next year things will be good enough that the world can come back here in a way that resembles the Munich Security Conference we've come to know over these many years. And good luck in your new role.
Many, many thanks, and see you next time.
Thank you. Ian, interesting in this discussion of the hierarchy of crises here. How do you rank these? Because obviously Russia is a short-term element. We hope. I mean, maybe this crisis will go on for a long time. I'm reminded of that great phrase. I always loved it. Russia is the hurricane. China is climate change. Right? That Russia tries to disrupt. China's trying to rewrite the rules. Now, all of a sudden, we're seeing the Russians try to rewrite the rules.
Or break the rules, undermine the rules. I don't see them trying to rewrite them, to be honest with you. I see the Russians deeply dissatisfied with a global order that is going against them, with NATO that's expanding, with climate change that isn't good for them, with technological advances that are mostly about the United States and China. a Russian economy that is nowhere close to where it was 20 years ago. I think they don't like it. I think they're lashing out. But it would be nice if the Russians were putting forward an alternative set of rules. I mean, the Chinese actually have said, here are some things that we are prepared to do. The Russians aren't playing that role. And I think one of the most interesting things to play out, even if this goes badly, is that the Chinese do not like the notion that the Russians are prepared to militarily upset the apple cart. They don't want it. They made it very clear that they actually support Ukrainian territorial integrity and that they want an outcome through the Minsk process. So what happens? And they made that clear just yesterday after Xi Jinping spoke with French President Emmanuel Macron. How do the Chinese respond if this escalates? I mean, yes, you're right, climate change is the big long-term thing, but right now, the crisis that is truly dominating the Munich Security Conference is, does the global order pivot to something radically different if this goes badly? We had westlessness. Well, is it now westfulness? Or are we heading into a new Cold War where the world's most powerful military adversary to the US suddenly aligns strategically with the world's most economic adversary to the US, China? And I think that that is a world order that the Chinese fundamentally don't want, and the Russians are increasingly resigned to. Interesting to see how that plays.
Well, no one would be better to take up that topic, Ian, than our next guest and visitor here, an old friend of mine, Anne-Marie Slaughter. Anne-Marie, welcome. We're delighted to have you here. Anne-Marie is, of course, the Chief Executive Officer of the New America. She's the former Director of Policy Planning at the U.S. State Department, and, of course, was Dean at what was once known as the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton. So, Anne-Marie, I'm going to ask you for a moment to pretend as if you were back running the policy planning operation under Hillary Clinton, when I would wander by your office and say, so what are you working on? And you'd say, wish I could tell you, but I can't. Okay? But, and supposing the secretary had tasked you to answer the two questions that Ian just brought up. One is, what do the Chinese want out of this? They're in this temporary alliance of convenience with the Russians, but they can't be so happy about this, and the Russians aren't so happy about being the number two to China. And second, the secretary might ask you, tell me in the long term, what's the strategy that puts Putin back in the box?
Well, David, first place, it's great to be here and to be talking to you. Honestly, as you were asking me those questions, I was thinking, when I was a professor and a dean, I got to pose the questions. That's like an exam question. So
this is why I stayed a reporter.
Exactly.
Emily, right. God forbid somebody actually asked me one of these, right?
Yeah, those are really hard. And I'm going to start actually just by reminding everyone that 2 years ago, we were all here and it was westlessness. 15 years ago, Putin gave a blistering speech here at the Munich Security Conference where he essentially announced he was not to be trifled with. Russia was back. Russia was a superpower. And that goes to the question, I think, today, where if he can't be a player, he's going to be a spoiler. Also, the last thing he wants is not just Ukraine joining NATO. Ukraine is not going to join NATO, certainly not in the foreseeable future. But he can't abide a stable, prosperous, democratic Ukraine, even worse, a much less corrupt Ukraine, right there where every Russian can see it. And so part of what's going on here is to constantly destabilize Ukraine. It makes it very hard then for Ukraine to be the westward-leaning, EU-friendly, NATO-friendly country that they want to be. And I think that's a big part of this that gets lost when we just think of it as a West versus Russia crisis. What does Putin want long term? Well, he wants to stay in power. He wants to keep his money. These are the levers that we have against him in terms of sanctions. But more broadly, and this will go to the question of China too, he wants to be a player. I always think to myself, having grown up in the Cold War, what if the United States had lost the Cold War? And then for 15 years, nobody even mentioned us. Like we weren't even a player on the global stage. So there are ways that Putin has to be a player on the global stage. We have to offer some carrots as well as unquestionably the sticks. When we focus on climate change, when we focus on a lot of global crises, then both Russia and China are much more essential to solving those problems. So one thing that I do think we have to stand firm, I think he's created at this point a multi-partner world in a way that 10 years ago in the policy planning department, we would have loved. But at the same time, I do think we have to think about how we engage both Russia as we think about engaging China on bigger global problems.
Well, it's not as if you didn't try. I mean, you were in the State Department during the whole effort to do a reset in the relationship. And obviously, we've tried several different resets with Russia. The first president who came in saying, I'm not looking for a reset was Joe Biden, right? He said, I want a stable, predictable relationship, which I don't think are the adjectives I would use to go mark the first year of U.S.-Russian relations out here. Are we past the moment of resets?
Well, reset, I do remember being part of the reset, and it didn't quite work, although we did negotiate the New START treaty. And that's really important. Those are still, hundreds of nuclear weapons that need to be at least controlled in ways that we were able to work with them. We were able to do that. I don't think we're looking for, a great friendship with Russia. I think recognizing that, of course, Russia does have important security interests in Russia itself, in its neighborhood, but at the same time saying you may not change things by force or by the kind of new force of cyber and constant destabilization. So having very bright lines, but also letting Putin be on the global stage, at least periodically when we're talking about issues where we really do need Russia, both economic issues, energy issues, climate issues, and indeed even cyber norms, where we have to take Russia seriously, even as we're insisting no further. Because he's clearly testing us.
Brad, I want to ask you to sort of comment on Anne-Marie's thought here. So there was a time soon after the Soviet Union fell when we were talking about reintegrating Russia into Europe, into the West, and so forth. It was a big effort to go out to the business community. I remember this quite well, to say, this is the moment to go invest. Yeltsin was around. He was open to everything. He'd come to the United States. He'd meet with business executives. Except in the petroleum arena, it didn't really happen. Why not?
Well, I think you saw, as we've discussed here, certain geopolitical forces reemerge, and Anne-Marie captured that well. I would note at the same time, though, certain trends have continued. I mean, even in a country like Russia or a country like China, we're seeing the ongoing adoption of more technology. Not necessarily always, from the same U.S. tech companies. Sometimes they're local companies, say, especially in China. Sometimes with, very different controls. But I think it would be a mistake to say that, commerce has collapsed. You certainly see ongoing interaction, including in a country like Russia, including in a country like China. You see basic research bring people together, whether you're talking about fundamental issues around the future of energy and energy production, or artificial intelligence and the like. So there might not be quite the scale or type of integration that people expected 2 or 3 decades ago, but it definitely hasn't gone back to, say, the way it was in the 1970s either.
Anne-Marie, I know that your time is limited, but I didn't want to let you go without talking a little bit about disinformation at home and abroad, because you've written so thoughtfully on these issues in articles, books, and so forth. So we have two big disinformation problems going on simultaneously now. We have the Russian disinformation that the United States has been trying to call out along the way, and even U.S. intelligence being declassified in a way that must seem pretty shocking to you compared to your last time in government. And then we have a disinformation problem here at home. We've got 40% of Americans who still say they don't believe Joe Biden fairly won the 2020 election. We have more distrust of the American system than we've ever had before. Those were not characteristics of the American democracy when we last had to deal with a threatening Russia and before that Soviet Union. Tell us a little bit about that dynamic.
Well, David, I do think longer term, that is the single biggest threat that Russia poses. And the two are definitely connected. I mean, the information domain is a domain of conflict. It is a battlefield. And Putin is a former KGB agent who knows all of the traditional tricks of how you make people, how you use information to divide and conquer, how you smear people, how you tell lies that are so big that people start to think, well, there must be something there, how you tell the truth about 60% of the time and then smear the other percentage of the time. That's what we're seeing with Ukraine. And I have to say, I think the Biden administration's counter-information strategy has been brilliant, right? They're constantly releasing things, controlling the tempo of who's releasing information and forcing Putin more on the defensive. But of course, it's also Putin's troll farms that have been deeply implicated in first of all, making sure that lots of Americans don't know what to believe, helping the entire Trump campaign. What happens when you see 40% of Americans not believing in the election, or for that matter, the vaccine? That is exactly what Russia wants. In any democracy, if you don't have anything that you can believe as true, it destabilizes your country. So longer term, and this really may be longer term in terms of digital literacy, in terms of really training Americans and others to understand that information can be manipulated this way, that's as important, frankly, as any other military strategy we can adopt.
Well, thank you, Anne-Marie. You and I could go on this topic for hours, and we have in the past. So we hope that we'll have a chance to pick this up with you soon. But thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Great. So, Ian, thinking about what Anne-Marie just said here, and about how the Biden administration has handled all of this, the U.S. has never been that good at information warfare. Not our strong suit. But this has been a strange couple of weeks and quite different.
Well, I do think it's easier to combat information warfare when the entire world is laser focused on an issue. And let's face it, there isn't a partisan divide in the United States on the Russia crisis. That's unusual. I mean, if we think back on the crises that the United States has experienced over the past years, whether it's Afghanistan or Iraq or the Iran issue, nuclear deal, dealing with the Chinese, North Korea, and of course, especially January 6th in the US elections, there's been a lot of disagreement, a lot of places where disinformation types can play. On this, the fact is Republicans and Democrats in the United States, as well as pretty much all the NATO allies, agree on a fundamental number of things. Number one, Ukraine should be provided with defensive arms to be able to deal with a Russian intervention. Number two, Ukraine is not joining NATO anytime soon, and nobody wants to offer that to them. Number three, everyone prefers a diplomatic outcome, as you've heard from our Deputy Secretary General from NATO. Number four is that if you can't get a negotiated outcome, you want to ensure that you are pushing as hard as possible for effective deterrence so that the Russians don't think that invasion is costless to them. And finally, they want strong multilateral alignment with the allies. The fact is, there just hasn't been as much room for the Russians to play on this issue, unlike vaccine disinformation, unlike January 6th or the Canadian trucker crisis. This is a very different place. And yeah, the fact that Biden decided that he was going to work the phones harder than on anything else he's done so far this year, and that they've worked to communicate, to over-communicate, as opposed to following Afghanistan, where it looked like the Americans were caught flat-footed by the Taliban suddenly taking over, I think has also helped in that regard.
Great. Well, we are very lucky to have as our next guest Kersti Kaljulaid. She served as president of Estonia from 2016 until just last year. She was also Estonia's first woman head of state. Welcome, Kersti. It's great to have you here.
Hello, everybody. Happy to be here.
Thank you. So we're all watching the Ukraine border, and you are too. But there's a concern which we heard from Secretary Tony Blinken in his speech at the United Nations. We've heard from President Biden, and that is that if the Russians do take part or all of Ukraine, they're unlikely to stop there. Tell us what you think the threat is, if any, to the Baltic states like Estonia that have joined NATO.
Well, I don't think that in 21st century we can say that geography actually is so important in whether you are under threat. Yes, if you think of conventional threats, then obviously if we allow something bad to happen to Ukraine and our response is weak, then indeed Ukraine, which is right now not fighting only for Ukraine, but for all of us, has failed. It would be very unfair to let Ukrainians fight alone for us. So we need to make sure that Ukraine has enough capabilities and capacity to pose a serious threat also to Russia, which actually I think Ukrainian army does. And I think if anything is withholding things going radically wrong today, this is the risk of many bitter mothers also in Russia, because it will be horrible, not only for Ukraine, it will be horrible also for Russia. And I so hope that it still will not happen. But we have to stand up for Ukraine because they are fighting there also, indeed, I agree, for the freedom of us all, democratic world. Can we be bullied? Can we leave some of us, and say, okay, the rest are still safe? Today, Baltic states and Poland are safe. NATO has a 100% track record. Can we be satisfied with such an approach, throwing bits and pieces of our deterrence away, saying maybe we withdraw the troops? I don't think we can.
If the world can preserve Ukraine's territorial integrity, tell us what's the right model for them. We're all in agreement they're not joining NATO anytime soon, as Ian just said. But is the right model Finland, an independent country that is not a member of NATO, but is just on the edge of that? Is it more like Austria? Is it something entirely different? What's the model we should think about that works for a Ukraine that isn't in NATO, but which we all agree needs to be defended?
It's interesting how also you referred to preserving Ukrainian territorial integrity. We have first to achieve it. Crimea is occupied.
Sure.
And we must not forget it. It also hurts my ear when we speak about Minsk and Normandy, and nobody even speaks about Budapest anymore. Let's not forget that already a lot of ground has been lost, which we need to, with strategic patience, with smart diplomacy, but also being strong together, we need to crawl back. So let's agree on that. Second, I do think indeed that Ukraine needs to be given an opportunity to participate with the NATO allies in a union which recognizes that the red line they are standing at right now is not about Ukraine. It's about free and democratic world. It's about European security. It is something bigger. If we are only too focused on Ukraine and whether it will be a slice or a bigger slice, I think we are missing the big picture, the important picture.
So Estonia, of course, was the site of a quite massive cyber attack out of Russia in 2007. it hit the government, it hit the private sector, and more importantly, it gave Estonia a cyber religion that I think is more deeply felt than in most nations. You're, of course, the home of the Nato Cyber Center for Excellence. You've thought a lot and done a lot in the world of cybersecurity. But here we are, 15 years later, and suddenly we are all thinking about what are the cyber vulnerabilities that Russia could exploit in Ukraine, in Western Europe, in the United States. What's your assessment? How much progress has the world made in those 15 years? And what do you wish we had done that would put us in a better position today if this does go bad with Russia?
If we talk about cyber conventional risks of the type which Estonia suffered, so you have a physical attack on your digital infrastructure. I mean, physical in this sense that some functions are taken offline and it cannot function, a DDoS activity. This is relatively simple, actually. We could have developed our international legal base quicker. UN Security Council has taken notice during the last 2 years of the need to debate also and discuss also cyber conflicts as part of a bigger, conflict. But we also need an international settlement place or a body somewhere where you can go and complain and seek assurance that if you are now going also, to defend yourself or even, overstepping that line and getting offensive, that you are actually on a safe international rule of law base. This we could have done better. But I don't think conventional cyber risks are the major issue here. We have been so happy that democracy has been gaining ground, that people want to live in free democratic countries. Ukrainian people want, Georgian people want, Moldovan people want, people globally, in majority, want that. But while we have been marching with this front ahead, a partisan war has broken out precisely in the cyber domain, trying indeed to break our democracies. And this is trickier, this hybrid risk. This is the real risk. It's very easy to start a panic, let's say, about Russia doing something on NATO territory in the cyberspace. Before we find out, many people believe this has actually happened. Try to imagine these scenarios. I think this is the big risk. And also all what we see, this kind of disruption to societies. Previously, there was also a lot of dissatisfaction in our societies, and this is also partially, our mistakes as leaders of the nations. But this dissatisfaction was scattered. Nowadays, with the social media, everybody who is skillful enough can actually, gather this scatter and then divert it towards resolving their cause, driving their cause. I think Brexit was a clear example of how this was achieved. Something similar can happen in many countries, in many democratic nations, and this is the partisan war against our societies. So we should also be aware of that, not only these conventional cyber risks, which are relatively easy to understand, recognize, attribute, also to react.
Well, President Kaljulaid, I know that you are moving from event to event here and have a pretty busy schedule at the Security Conference, but I can't thank you enough for coming and sharing those thoughts with us, and I wish you good luck and Estonia good luck as it sits right on the edge of this conflict. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you. And we still trust NATO with its 100% track record. We have seen how the deterrence levels have risen since 2014 in Baltics. And of course, we are safe. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Brad, President Kaljulaid brought up the issue that the world has sort of been looking around for some rules that guide all of this. And you and I have talked for years about the development of cyber norms. The Paris Call, which you took a significant role in, has brought a lot of companies together with some ideas about what you do and do not do in cyberspace. But I have to say, I've been pretty disappointed in the pace at which governments, including the government of the United States, has taken on this issue. Why is this so hard?
Well, I think in part it reflects, frankly, some of the issues that you wrote about in your book, David, the perfect weapon. Basically, cyber weapons raised anew a set of techniques, of threats, of weapons themselves, that were not always clearly governed by the norms in place. And so, that has called on governments and others to work together to advance the international rules and norms we need. I think at times we face skepticism from some and some governments. They ask, do these norms matter? If you're going to have a government violate the rules, do we need to create new rules? And my answer is always absolutely yes, because norms and rules define the lines that must not be crossed. And it's only by defining those lines that we create the opportunity for international consensus and action to respond or deter that kind of action. I would say directionally things are going in the way they should, but the pace is too slow. Really exactly what you said. And I think it was held back, frankly, for 4 years because we had an administration in the United States that didn't share the long-standing American commitment to multilateralism. And so, we had to pick up for that in other ways. And in some ways, the international NGO community, the international business community, rallied around it. European governments were quick to embrace it. And the good news is that in the last year, we saw the United States sign the Paris Call. I think we have a lot of additional work to do, especially around some of the issues we're talking about here. A norm that ensures that we protect electoral processes and the essence of democracy. A norm that addresses what Anne-Marie was talking about, foreign state-sponsored disinformation. And I would say at the end of the day, technology and science move a lot faster than politics and diplomacy and basic human nature. So for me, it's not something that causes a lack of hope or conviction. I think to the contrary, we just need to keep doubling down and moving forward.
I want to add to that, which is I completely agree that when you see countries and non-state actors challenging norms in particularly egregious ways, the right way to respond is to strengthen those norms and create new norms. But let's also be clear that over the past decade, what we have seen is an increasing erosion of those norms, an increasing willingness of rogue actors to breach those norms, and an unwillingness of many governments, including the United States, to effectively stand up. We saw that, of course, with the red line in Syria, Assad must go. We saw that, for example, in terms of Georgia in 2008, in Ukraine in 2014. We've seen it in Afghanistan. We've seen it in Myanmar. We've seen it in Venezuela. We've seen it in Haiti. And I think what we're seeing right now at the Munich Security Conference is a decision by the United States and all of its allies that this line is too far. Enough.
Well, it's really interesting to hear you say that because in the cyber realm, we've seen great hesitance or fear of escalation to go strike back, and a little bit in this Biden administration, but people beginning to question that. Were we too cautious? And I'm wondering whether the current crisis is going to feed that thought and make the United States a little less concerned about what escalation could look like, and a little bit more concerned about what's happening right now.
I've heard that from members of cabinet. You look at something like the Havana syndrome, and this question of these hundreds of diplomats who have, and their families, Americans who have ended up with some level of brain damage around the world. And there is pretty strong conviction in the intelligence community in the US that the Russians are behind this, but we don't have proof. And we also haven't done anything about it. And there's a view of we need to respond more strongly when a country like Russia is going to take action against the US. Think about the 2016 election interference, and that Obama, for many reasons that we don't need to relitigate right now, decided that he was going to respond late and limited. And I think that Putin has taken a great number of lessons from all of that. We all are asking, what lessons is China going to take from Ukraine? No, the most important lesson, what lessons is Putin taking from America's own recent past? And we are living with the legacy of that. And I fully agree with you, David. And I'm sure that your point comes from many conversations you've had in this administration, that there is a belief that the Americans must be willing to have a tougher response when their norms continue to be chipped away at piece by piece by piece.
Well, Ian, Brad, I could go on with this discussion with you two for the whole evening. And there are probably people out there watching, wondering whether that's exactly what we're about to go do. But while I'm not out of questions, we are out of time. And so I want to thank you both. I'm David Sanger, and I want to thank all of our guests, but particularly Brad and Ian for joining us. Thank all of you for watching, and let's hope for a peaceful weekend and time beyond. Thank you very much.